Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Starchild podcast. I'm Starchild, your host. Today, I am going to be discussing wealth inequality and progressive capitalism, which has been a subject that I've been interested in for 6 to 7 years now, um, since I've been studying economics and behavioral economics. Um, so here is a gentleman that I have been researching for a number of years now. His name is Ray Dalio. He is the largest hedge fund owner, which is called Bridgewater Associates. And he speaks a lot about the wealth gap and wealth inequality and what to do about it. Another progressive capitalist that I'm fond of is Joseph Stiglitz, who wrote the book on progressive capitalism, literally titled Progressive Capitalism. Here he is speaking at the World Economic Forum. Robert Reich, another progressive capitalist, worked under Bill Clinton as his economic advisor, and actually was the last economist to leave federal surplus. Here is Jeremy Rifkin, who was a professor at the Wharton School of Economics in Pennsylvania. He talks a lot about the fourth industrial revolution and the call of a massive infrastructure plan to reskill American workers for the 21st century. And Bernie Sanders, who I believe is a progressive capitalist as well. I don't think he's a socialist or democratic socialist like he says he is. I think he's more of a progressive capitalist. So overall, in a nutshell, spending drives the economy. And that's why I think behavioral economics, above all else, is important here. Because to understand economics is understanding human behavior and psychology, essentially. We're all given 24 hours in a day, and what we spend with our time is how we allocate our time. And those daily decisions are economic decisions, essentially, because time is the most valuable commodity because we have a very limited amount of it. And our financial decisions are also economic decisions. And so, since spending drives the economy, I think it's best to have a very robust middle class rather than a dwindling middle class that we've seen over the past several decades, because as wealthy people have been acquiring more wealth, because wealth is cyclical just as poverty is cyclical. And as the wealthy acquired more wealth, they became more powerful and had more influence over politics. And economics is able to influence politics. And we've seen that over the years. And now we have kind of a plutocracy type situation where the top 1% of the wealthiest Americans are influencing our politics to benefit only the shareholders rather than the average American. So we have kind of an economic system of that only really an economic and political system that really only cares about shareholders rather than average American wage earners. So here we go. As a part of human nature, we tend to be short-sighted. Oh, sorry, that's not the beginning. Here we go. So the economy may seem like a complex machine. However, it is more simple than it may appear. The economy is made up of... Hang on. The economy is made up of a few fundamental transactions that are driven by human nature. These transactions create three main forces that drive the economy. The first being the productivity growth that we see on the left. That's driven by human creativity, human ambition, determination, inspiration, the entrepreneur mindset, the inventor mindset. That's what drives civilization forward. That's the overall productivity growth. That is then balanced out by the debt that is created by kind of the rest of the population. Secondly, is the long-term debt cycle. And third is the short-term debt cycle, which lasts roughly 5 to 10 years. Meanwhile, the long-term debt cycle is longer, roughly 70 to 100 years long. And these three main forces are a good template for tracking economic movements. Transactions are made up of buyers and sellers that exchange goods, services, financial assets for money and credit. All cycles in an economy are driven by these transactions, and in a market, buyers and sellers specialize in certain goods and services or financial assets. There are markets for millions of things, and all of these markets and transactions make up the overall economy. People, businesses, and banks, as well as governments, all engage in these daily market transactions on the micro and macro scales, exchanging money or credit for goods and services or financial assets. That's what these transactions are. The largest of these buyers and sellers is the United States government, which is divided into two main parts. First main part is the central government, and the second being the central bank, which are not connected, though they kind of are. The central government controls fiscal policy through spending and collection of taxes, and the central bank controls the monetary spending of money and credit in the economy. The central bank influences interest rates and printing new money at the Federal Reserve, just like buyers and sellers, lenders and borrowers make transactions with one another. Lenders want to earn interest on the money lent out, while borrowers need money for things that they cannot afford. When interest rates are high, there is less borrowing. And when interest rates are low, borrowing money increases. And that's what causes these short-term debt cycles, which then add up to the large-term debt cycle. When this lender and borrower transaction happens, it creates credit. Once credit is created, it is then turned into debt, which is an asset to the lender and a liability to the borrower. Once the loan plus interest is paid, then the borrower and the debt and asset are all settled. Once you receive good credit as a borrower, your spending can increase as well. And everyone's spending drives the economy. You may refer to the phrase high tides lift all boats, which alludes to the income effect. When one person's income goes up, their spending goes up, and when they consume more, another person somewhere earns more, and their income goes up, and the cycle continues. The income effect also happens in reverse when we're going through recession or economic slowdowns. The more money that you earn, the more that you will spend, and the spending will benefit another person's income. We call this the income effect, and the increased income leads to an increase in borrowing, which then leads to an increase in spending. This entire pattern creates economic growth, which we see on this upswing on the long-term debt cycle. And as we grow as human beings, we acquire new knowledge throughout life and can raise our living standards, which we call our own individual productivity growth. on the micro scale, creativity and hardworking people can individually raise their living standards, oftentimes more so than those who are uninspired and lazy and more complacent. That's why I think it's imperative to hang on to your creative, imaginative spark that you have as a child, that oftentimes gets beaten out of you as you grow up in society. I think it's absolutely imperative that you hang on to that with dear life, because that's what creates the next invention. That's what creates the next vaccine. That's what creates the next song. That's what creates the next film. It's just what we should all aspire to be. We should just all aspire to be greater and bigger than ourselves, and that is driven through being inspired by others' creativity. So overall, this matters most in the long run, because credit matters more in the short run, because credit fluctuates much more than productivity growth does. Debt helps drive our economic growth because it allows us to consume more than we produce. That's why the debt cycle is above the productivity line. We are consuming more than we are producing. And then when the debt burden becomes too large, we have to pay those debts back. And then we go through a deleveraging slowing period. And that's what progressive capitalism is all about, is the balancing of these cycles and understanding human behavior much more so than this plutocracy, crony capitalism system that we have in place now, that I think is just absolutely appalling, and is the main reason why I'm making this episode. So these debt cycles occur in the long and short run. The short run debt cycle happens roughly every 5 to 8 years. Meanwhile, the long-term debt cycle happens roughly 70 to 100 years. The last one really being the Great Recession in 2008, even though that was not a well-handled deleveraging. And, we didn't let the banks fail. The American people had to bail them out. And now we have a homeless crisis, an opioid crisis, and the real estate market did not get regulated properly. There's still subprime mortgage loans being given out, and corporate debt is above $10 trillion right now, and the corporate debt bubble is really the one to be looking out for. And as part of human nature, we tend to be very short-sighted thinkers, oftentimes short-term thinkers, without a plan in life, just kind of taking each day as it comes. And if we were to take a step back, we would see this picture in front of us. We would see the big picture of the economic cycles and the three forces that drive them. And these economic cycles are a result of credit, which is typically borrowed more when you're young and then scaled back as you become older. So when you're young, you take out student loans, and then this is how the system is thinking today. When you're young, you take out a bunch of loans and then you have to pay them back when you're older. But that's not what progressive capitalism is saying. It's saying that we need to balance these cycles more appropriately, rather than putting the burden on the working class. The cycles need to be balanced by taxing the wealthy, by redistributing wealth with the wealth tax and comprehensive tax reform, as well as printing of money from the Federal Reserve, comprehensive monetary policy, as well as cutting back the military budget. That's also a progressive capitalist idea, because an $800 billion annual military budget is just absolutely ludicrous. I'm absolutely for the military. And for servicemen and women, I think they actually deserve a raise. However, I think there's a lot of wasteful spending that can be cut back in the military. Um, so that's where I would seek to cut back on government spending, as well as accompany that with a wealth tax and comprehensive tax reform, and make sure that some of the largest corporations are actually paying their annual federal income taxes. But I don't think that the current system of burdening young people with a bunch of debt early on is the best way to inspire them to be creative later in life. I think we need to give younger people a more fair shake at life early on, and set them up for success rather than debt. These economic cycles are true for all individuals at all levels, as well as for markets on the macro and micro level. Most of the world's money is actually in credit, not physical dollars. And in the United States, there's over $50 trillion in credit versus about $3 trillion in physical dollars. Credit is only bad, however, when it finances overconsumption on things that can't be paid back, or really doesn't help create income. And that's where a lot of the corporate debt bubble comes from, financing a lot of these new startups that end up failing and then ultimately cannot pay back their debts. And that's what we're seeing happen right now. Similar to what happened with the housing crisis back in 2008 with the subprime mortgages. In the United States, there is $50 trillion in credit versus $3 trillion physical money. The income effect can work in reverse as well, however, and as economic activity increases, overconsumption creates inflation, driving prices up, which then eventually forces interest rates on borrowing money to rise, which then slows spending, reversing the income effect. So again, overconsumption creates the inflation, which increase prices on things. And when prices go up, people start substituting for cheaper commodities, which changes the demand for certain things, and slows down economic activity. And when people spend less, prices then go down, and we call this deflation. This causes economic activity to decrease, causing a recession. When prices go back up, the central bank lowers the interest rates again, and the economy booms. And bull markets, however, bull markets cannot last forever due to the debt burden. And at some point, debt repayments grow faster than income comes, or revenues rise, which forces them to cut back on spending. So that's what we'll see here in the next year or two, as the debt burden becomes too big for a lot of these corporations that cannot pay back their debts. And that's probably what's going to set off the next recession. And in the next podcast, I'll talk about investing and how to retire really in the 21st century, and how these recessions and kind of deleveragings can be opportunities, can be a great opportunity if you're a young investor that's looking to get into the markets and invest. However, a recession is really bad for those who are approaching retirement age and are about to retire, and a lot of their money is in 401k mutual funds. And then the markets crash right before you retire. And then you have to wait another 10 years for the short-term cycle to recover. A lot of economists think that we're at a tipping point, however, in the long-term debt cycle. which happens roughly 70 to 100 years. I agree with this because in the last recession was supposed to be uh, um, even more significant than it actually was, because we ended up just patching it with printing of money and taxing the American people. But really, regulation should have handled the corrupt banking practices better than it did, because those banks are still there, engaging in those corrupt lending practices. That's creating all these giant debt bubbles, which is good in the short term for shareholders, but bad in the long term. So we're kind of seeing this tipping point in the long term debt cycle in the U.S., similar to 2008, that happened in Europe and the United States and much of the world. During a deleveraging period, borrowers have lost their ability to repay their debts, and then lenders stop lending and borrowers stop borrowing. And when debt burdens become too large, then there are four ways to help bring them down. The first way is for people, businesses, and governments to cut their spending, such as military spending. That's the first place that I would cut, anyways, because $800 billion again annually is a snake eating its own tail over time. I think it's slowly hurting. It's not slowly, it is hurting this country economically. All that money going overseas rather than into our education and healthcare systems. And when our debt burdens become too large, these four ways are, in my opinion, and Ray Dalio's opinion, and a lot of the progressive capitalist opinion, these are the best ways to handle our economic situations, and to help increase economic activity, such as cutting government spending, cutting the military budget and allocating those funds elsewhere, such as education, infrastructure, healthcare. The second way to bring down our debt burden is to reduce debts through default and debt restructuring, which should have happened in 2008. However, it did not. Instead, the big banks were bailed out, and the debt burden is now reinflated to this day. And economists are worried that the next recession will be worse than the last recession, which, again, is bad for those who are about to retire, but could be a huge opportunity for new investors and young people who are looking to retire. Because once again, the long-term debt cycles really only crash every 70 to 100 years. So once they crash, then that's kind of a window of opportunity for new investors, because the markets are releveling, resetting, and it's an opportunity for new investors to purchase market indexes much cheaper than they normally would. And then the third way to balance our economy is to redistribute concentrated wealth from the wealthiest by comprehensive progressive tax reforms and a wealth tax, making sure that the largest corporations and wealthiest Americans are actually paying their taxes. And fourth, the central banks continually print new money, which is known as quantitative easing. Just keeps the flow of money, keeps the flow of the economy like a river flowing steadily. That's what monetary policy is for. And all of this affects the central government as well as uh, less people are spending and incomes go down, people pay less taxes to the government. When incomes go down, people are spending less in taxes, and governments then have less money to work with, less tax revenue. And at the same time, unemployment is rising, and therefore government spending has to increase. So it's kind of a double negative. Less tax revenue coming in, higher unemployment, and government spending increasing is all leading to slow down an economy, and therefore more of a reason to restructure debt, to cut our military spending, redistribute the wealth through a wealth tax, and quantitative ease through monetary policy. Government budgets deficits explode in a deleveraging because they spend way more than they earn in taxes. And since governments need more money, and since wealth is concentrated in a small percentage of the population, governments enforce current tax laws because much of the extremely wealthy pay little in taxes compared to the size of their wealth in comparison, as well as increasing taxes on the ultra wealthy. This facilitates the redistribution of wealth in the economy, which prevents social disorder and helps stimulate economic growth. Again, a lot of these economic policies are preventative measures as to cure future problems as well as current problems that we're facing. Because a lot of our current problems can get a lot worse if nothing is done about them. So I think these kind of fundamental progressive policies are a really good start on transferring our economy away from the shareholder dominated economy and more towards a strong wage economy. If these economic policies are not enacted, then social unrest between the haves and have-nots could break out, sometimes causing extreme political change, and economic downturn led to the rise of Hitler in Germany and the Great Depression in the United States. And this is where the central bank's role then decreasing interest rates and increasing the printing of money to stimulate the economy comes in to prevent social unrest, because a lot of times the poor even fight themselves rather than fighting where the wealth is concentrated because of distractions and psychological subversion and the media and things like that. So again, preventative measures. Printing money is inflationary and stimulative. The central bank then uses this money to buy financial assets and government bonds and lend money to the big banks. In 2008, the central bank printed over $2 trillion to bail out the big banks who engaged in predatory lending to borrowers with poor or little credit that couldn't keep up with payments. This is why policy makes the need to borrow This is why policymakers need to balance the four ways to bring down the debt burden and make these economic downturns less severe by cutting government military spending and other spending, reducing debt through restructuring and defaults, as well as redistributing wealth through comprehensive progressive tax reforms and lowering interest rates, keeping interest rates low as they are now, but keeping them low, and increasing quantitative easing. I believe we could have greater growth and less severe downturn in our economic cycles than our current crony capitalism system that's perpetuated by plutocrats, i.e. the wealthiest Americans. Top 1% own over 83% of the total wealth in America, and the top 10% of shareholders own a majority of the stocks as well. So whereas like 50% of Americans might own some stock, a majority of the assets are owned by an actual select few. Overall, it is my belief that this is the best possible way forward to achieve a strong economy and reduce poverty as well as unemployment. Progressive capitalism is, in my opinion, an economic path forward for equity and away from crony capitalism, which has abused the middle class and gets abused by the extremely wealthy and powerful. This can only be achieved through education and exercising our individual rights as citizens, such as voting and activism. We have a situation where the shareholders of the largest corporations now control not only the economy, but the political system as well. So to undo all of that, to undo the crony capitalist system, first we have to vote, exercise our rights to vote that we take for granted, in my opinion. If you're not registered to vote, that should be on your list of things to do today. And remain active in your communities so that politics can change your local economy as well, and so that the politics don't get abused. So that is my summary on progressive capitalism. Next week, I will discuss this a little bit further, along with where I believe millennials should and young people should allocate their resources to on a path to retirement, because retirement can be really confusing, and it's in my opinion that a lot of young people have zero interest in how to retire, because they think that it's not going to ever happen, which saddens me to no end, that our current economic system just drains the hope out of young people, which also drains their creativity and their brilliant imaginations, which you never know could be the next cure for cancer. But if that kid can't afford to go to school or afford school lunch, then they're never going to come up with that cure or vaccine. So it's up to the voters to show up to the voting booth to make sure that the policies change. And once the policies change, then the economic situations will eventually get better. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Starchild, your host. Visit my website, starchildgallery.com, and all of my information will be posted in the description below, including links to my social media and my shop, which really helps support this channel. And I will see you guys again next week. Thank you so much. Bye.